welcome to the last session before we all leave Ethical Finance 2020 and set off on our path to COP26. I'm Allan Watt, an advisor to GEFI, and I'll be handing over after this to JB Beckett, who'll be interviewing Anne Simpson from CalPERS. But to start, just like CalPERS, the Norwegian government pension fund Global is one of the best known and most talked about names in the investment world. It's the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. It's invested the revenues from Norwegian oil and gas into more than 9,000 companies to provide a long-term future and protect against the volatility in the oil and gas markets. It has over $1 trillion in assets. Sitting alongside the fund is the Council on Ethics, which is an independent body that makes recommendations to the fund manager to put companies under observation or perhaps recommend their exclusion. I'm delighted that at Ethical Finance 2020 we've been able to bring Johan Andresen, Chair of the Council of Ethics, to join us and share some of his insights after 5 years leading the Council. Johan is also Chair of the Board of Ferd, one of the largest privately held groups in Norway. It's owned by him and his family. He's got 4 commercial arms in this business and a business unit dedicated to scaling social entrepreneurs. He also finds time to chair the Nordic Microfinance Initiative and Junior Achievement Europe. Now, I've read in Johan's 2019 annual report on the work of the Council that he's tasked with upholding the ethical guidelines adopted by the owners of Norway's fund, the people of Norway. That's a pretty challenging brief, and in our conversation, I'll look forward to hearing how you do that. But first, Johan, the story of Ferd itself is a really interesting one. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the history of Ferd and the journey and your philosophy of investing in ventures that make a difference.
How much time do you have? But I'll make sort of perhaps as a bridge into the appointment of being the chair of the Council on Ethics. Well, I'm the 5th generation. I'm the last generation of tobacco owners. So we divested the tobacco business in '98 when I took over. And since then, we've tried to become a value-based investor, taking responsibility that we may not have, trying out both experimental investments as well as making our own sort of legacy investments in packaging and sporting goods, oil and gas, etc., to become more sustainable, more responsible, more impactful. But yes, I hope that some of the stuff that we've done in the last 20 years have made me, how shall I put it, responsible enough to take on this position as the chair of the Council on Ethics.
Yeah. So obviously it's a very demanding role, and obviously you've run your own family business, but that's a pretty big family, 5.4 million Norwegians that you're representing. So it'd be helpful for all of our listeners and viewers today just to tell us a little bit about how the council works, what the respective roles of the investment management function of the Norges Bank and the Council of Ethics are.
Well, the Council of Ethics, as you rightly mentioned, Allan, is an independent entity, and we've been given guidelines by the Ministry of Finance. They've been ratified by the Parliament, which is, of course, representing the people in this case, and in every case, hopefully. And we then have the obligation to look at all the 9,000 plus companies in the fund and make a judgment on whether they constitute an ethical risk or not, according to those guidelines given to us. And then we give recommendations to the board of the central bank, which oversees the fund manager. And we can either recommend exclusion or observation. And the council has been in operation since 2004, and is continuously both evaluating the current companies in the fund, but also have to look at the companies already excluded or observed. So we actually our task is increasing in the sense that we also have to allow for the fact that these companies actually change their conduct and are and should come back into the fund.
And the fund has guidelines which are, I think you described as product-based and conduct-based. Maybe just tell us a little bit more about those two categories.
Yes, you might say that the product-based are sort of a clear sense of a political will. So you have tobacco, you have certain weapons, and of course, and these are, for instance, types of weapons that you would consider non-investable, like landmines, etc. And these are pretty much sort of go, no-go. Either if you produce these, then you are sort of more or less automatically excluded. The conduct-based is a much more judgment call, and that's where we spend most of our, I would say 95% of our time, in the fact that we actually have to discover which companies are actually violating international recognized ethical norms across a wide spectrum of criteria, from human rights, corruption, climate, environment, etc., etc. So, and this is where it actually becomes difficult. But that's also where, in a sense, the challenge and the intellectual fun, you might say, actually is.
Yeah, yeah. And difficult's a word that people often use. What does that actually feel like in terms of the discussions you have in your council, and then the discussion you might have with when you've published your report with the investment manager?
Well, I think what makes the Council of Ethics difference is both the fact that we have a huge fund that we advise, but also the fact that we publicize all our recommendations, whether they are followed or not. Mm-hmm. And these recommendations are quite comprehensive. Some of you might have read them. They are between 5-6 pages up to maybe 12-15. A lot of footnotes, satellite imagery if necessary, if it's tropical rainforest, etc. So they are not easily sort of explained away by the transgressor here, you might say. So and that makes it, in a sense, we have to really be comprehensive, and we really have to be thorough when we actually both make the recommendation and, of course, when we publish it, because we know that it can have a severe impact, both in terms of setting norms, but also on the company involved, and even perhaps their, the people working there. And so, but the dialogue we have with the fund manager along the way has been improved greatly in the last few years. But in the end, it's the central bank, the board of the central bank, who actually makes the decisions on whether to follow our recommendation or not. And they do, and they can. They have a third option, which is actually to engage in an ownership dialogue, which we can't recommend, but they can make that decision on their own accord.
Yeah. And obviously, so for obvious reasons, you publish after any divestments have taken place. But how do you select the companies to review? So there's 9,000 companies. How do you select the new companies to review? Obviously, somebody under observation, you'll keep going back. But how do you pick the new ones to look at?
We have 3 different sources, you might say, of inflow. One is we have web crawlers that actually that looks at all of the companies in the fund on 20 different languages and matches those towards words like pollution, environmental damage, tropical rainforest, corruption, child labor, etc., etc. The second one is that we have a large inflow of call it recommendations or things to look at from concerned citizens, be they civil society in terms of NGOs, academia, or even individual people.
Yeah.
And the third one is what we undertake on our own accord, on our own initiative, and those are often in terms of deep dives, in terms of industry studies, which could go into, for instance, in terms of corruption, it usually go into areas like defense, energy, and others where you have large parties. You have often state counterparties. You have secrecy. So there we will actually make industry studies and follow companies over time in order to compare them against each other, of course, and to establish thresholds. In some cases, we also do geographic focuses, like the study on the textile industry in Southeast Asia. We started with all the companies having textile operations in the fund, which I believe was around 340, and you narrow it down to a manageable size, where we ended up looking at maybe 40 or 50 in some countries, and then we move on, perhaps into other countries where we see that they have operations elsewhere than in Southeast Asia. So yeah, and we can keep at it for a long time, and so we, in a sense, we're like a dog that never lets go of the bone, in a sense, if we feel there's something left on it.
So that is maybe a good place to ask a question. So if I was the Director of Investor Relations or the CEO for one of these companies under investigation, and I pick up a phone call from the council or one of your advisors, how does that feel, or what usually happens next? How much of it is desk-based research, and how much is that active engagement and perhaps a bite on my ankle?
Well, actually, I think that's part of the role that has changed lately in the last 4 or 5 years. That the dialogue that we enter into with the companies have a greater impact than was previously thought, in the sense that both companies are now, I think, recognizing that there is a price to pay, both in terms of everything from evaluation to share price to ability to recruit, if you're excluded. So most companies actually do engage in a discussion. Mm-hmm. The few that don't, and there are a few actually that still do or don't engage, and they are then perhaps excluded on less grounds, on less certain grounds, you might say. But we feel that it's a responsibility, and the Parliament have said so, that there is a responsibility of the companies to answer. So those that actually do answer, many of them we feel actually are serious, in the sense that they, in many cases, perhaps exit a country where the risk is high. They divest. I don't know, it could be a mine. They drop a JV partner. They reduce the number of agents. They do a number of things that actually perhaps might end up actually reducing the ethical risk going forward, to the extent that we go from a hypothesis of excluding them to an observation level, or altogether put them aside and just keep them in mind for another time.
And just again, looking at some of the tweets from the Council of Ethics, this isn't just small companies or companies in. I think I was reading about Walmart coming back after making major changes to its supply chain and the way in which it dealt with it.
Yes, no, we in a sense have the obligation to look at all companies, and we should not focus on size, nor lands or countries or states. So we should try to be equally put in equal emphasis across the board. And in some cases, of course, big companies come to our attention perhaps more easily than smaller companies, which have a tendency to show up in industry studies rather than other ways. Yeah.
So I was actually reading in the FT earlier this year. Gillian Tett was writing about ESG indices were outperforming the wider market through the beginning of the impact of COVID, but she made a really important point, which I think you've started to cover, which is the companies that do that forensic analysis and audits of their supply chain get good ESG ratings, actually have a better understanding and perhaps more resilient to shocks like COVID. And looking ahead, she was suggesting this could be a forecast of companies' resilience to climate change, for example. And I think the interest in this week's Ethical Finance Summit tells us that ESG is very firmly in the mainstream. So I just wanted to explore with you, how do ethics and ESG overlap in the whole investment process for the Norway Fund?
Well, first of all, the Council of Ethics do not get involved in the actual process, but ESG is very much on top of mind from the fund manager's point of view, and they might also divest on their own initiative if they find that there is, call it ESG risk or even ethical risk in part of the portfolio, even before we have made a recommendation. So the difference then is that they will divest, but they will not necessarily, or actually they will not in most cases, divulge why they divested. You will simply see on their annual list that the company is no longer there. And they do send out regularly an updated letters of expectations on what they think companies should do in terms of complying to international laws and regulations. And they have singled out certain sectors like water, child labor, climate, corruption. So this is something that's ongoing, but the dialogue that they have with the companies is not something that is very clearly communicated, other than that they are having a lot of dialogue, but mostly concentrated on 700 of the, call it, most important companies. Right. But the Council of Ethics will have to look at all the other companies as well.
Yeah. And how do you set that? I mean, obviously, it's a very, it's quite binary. How do you set that threshold for excluding a company? That's and crossing that threshold.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's an endless effort trying to find the right threshold. From the outset, the threshold should be high. So it's not that we should exclude everything that we don't like or everything that the people of Norway dislikes. So we're focusing on, for instance, in terms of human rights, that there should be severe or systematic human rights violations. And we are not a referee, we're not a judge, we're not a court. So we look at risk going forward. So even though the companies may have been involved in violating certain norms, if they have plans, if they make changes, and they show sincerity, we can actually believe them, at least for a time being, by observing them. So actually where the threshold is actually depends on to what extent they actually are sincere about making changes. In some cases, it's violating human rights. It looks like it's part of their business model, or corruption is integral to their business, and then we just assess that they have no credibility when it comes to future changing, and so they in a sense reached it, or they reached a threshold because they do compose a future risk.
Yeah. So I also note you referenced George Orwell in 1984 in your report, and the challenges of dystopian society, future technology, surveillance as being areas that you might have to look at. What are the areas that you're currently focusing on in the council as a look forward? Yes,
no, we are concerned, you might say, and rightly so, about new technology developments. Surveillance is certainly one, and there are other, perhaps even more, call it, invasive technologies that can be abused both by state actors and also by private actors, and even by rogue actors. So I think the challenge here is that some of these companies, have dual use for their products. Some have, some are, if they're not listed, like some of them are, then it's not really our responsibility. But I think we're seeing more and more states that are actually using private actors as suppliers, and where the companies actually make a choice of whether they actually want to be part of these long-term contracts when it comes to setting up surveillance systems or other types of systems that are violating human rights. And we've just started on that route. So if you follow this very closely, you would see that there was a company that we made a recommendation on that the fund manager had already divested within the surveillance industry. So there is I would say that the fund manager is not necessarily sitting idle and thinking about this as well, because this clearly constitutes a risk financially as well, not only ethically.
Yeah, I mean, clearly data and privacy, these are huge issues for the future that, yes, I think it's probably one to be added to the list that we would all recognise. So, you know, quite interesting. As I say, it's a very big family. Everyone in Norway. How do you represent those norms, and how do you start to shift, or how do you gather or coalesce a sense of where they want their funds to be invested? Because that's quite a hard thing to do, I would imagine.
Yes, well, our role is actually try to coalesce where there is sort of a common denominator not to invest in. So there is a certain push towards using the fund for, call it, more political purposes. But so far that has been pushed back, or there's been some initiatives towards, green technology and more sustainable types of mandates, but so far they're very small, and we're not involved in those, at least not yet. So we have to actually think about, and you might get some indications in the committee report that was launched and sent over to the Ministry of Finance recently. I was also on that committee, where you might see that there are certain, for instance, just as an example, there are certain parts of the world where it's difficult to get information about the companies involved, and we have severe concerns about what's going on in those companies, and that we may end up keeping those companies simply because we don't have sufficient information. But so part of the recommendation from this committee is that we should probably be allowed to make a decision on less information. And this, I think, is a challenge for all investors, that they will, as markets open up and become more or less developed and become part of future indices, should one go in or not? Should one pre-select or not? But from the Council on Ethics point of view, we are basically left with the result of all those decisions, having to look at companies regardless.
Yeah. I mean, there isn't a ready-made recipe for the work you do, and I think conferences like this are a great way to share good practice. I mean, what bodies or collaborations have you found the most value from talking to help you shape your work?
Well, we sort of gather or try to understand from the whole plethora of international organizations, the UN, PRI, OECD, to actually understand how the expectations are moving, and what the norms, or if the norms are moving as well, and if the threshold is moving. So far, we have found that the threshold that we've set into different cases is valid, and that the new international norms, you might say, coming out of the OECD and the UN Global Initiative and everything, that they, human rights initiatives, that they perhaps are more relevant for the fund manager to see if there are other parts of, for instance, the supply chain that they should look at that constitutes a risk. So we are very open, and we will talk to almost anyone at any time, say yes to almost any meeting, join any panel anywhere. So we're happy to contribute the other way around as well. although because of the size, we have to be sometimes a little bit, I don't know, secretive of what, with regards to what specific companies we may be looking at.
Yeah. No. Thank you. And just one last question, or I suppose request for advice. I mean, I mentioned earlier the relative performance of ESG funds as COVID has hit us, and if you had a call to action for investors, as we deal with what would your call to action be as we deal with the lingering effects of COVID-19 through into 2021, and we look ahead, to COP26? Do you have a piece of advice for them in these turbulent times?
Well, I should be very careful by giving advice to others who are much more seasoned than I. But I think the risks are perhaps not only still there, but they are increasing in some sense, because some of the bad guys, maybe girls as well, are actually using the current sort of confusion and the pandemic to actually hide transgressions or norm violations. That could be everything from burning down the rainforest to abusing migrant workers. So at least we have taken the decision that we will try to use doing due diligence or information gathering enough to actually make recommendations without going into the field, because we can't sort of put the mandate on hold. And we are actually we are very dependent on actually getting field research, interviews with factory workers, laborers, etc. But we are now looking at other ways of doing it, since this pandemic seems like it's going to be around for another 12 months or so. Well, thank you, Johan, for those insights today, and for giving up all of your time for this really valuable conversation. I've really enjoyed looking under the bonnet of the fund and understanding much more about the Council of Ethics. So thank you again for your leadership here.